Hi guys. This is Natasha. She's a super amazing coach from Team Canada. She's going to be answering a few questions that we have today. And if you guys also have any questions, you're free to ask as well. So our first question is do you think that the feminism movement should prioritize more people or more passion?
Right. Okay. So this is a really loaded question, obviously, right? And I think it's super relevant to debate, and this is super relevant to like how we sort of like encounter social justice movements. I don't think this is a unique concern to feminism in any way. I think the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, this is like your go-to trade-off. And so there's like a two-part answer, I would say. So the first thing is, it depends on like what issues you're talking about because the feminist movement looks different depending on the context, depending on whether we're looking at like education rights within developing nations, whether we're looking for like, let's say, the wage gap when it comes to the developed world. And I feel like the approach or strategy that you take as a movement has to be like very context dependent, which is like for starters, you want to make sure that it is localized people that are part of like the framing of the movement, that are part of the strategy that you're taking. So what you would do in like one case isn't necessarily what you would do for another issue. That said, that like more general response. I think to like sort of answer this question, I'd say there are three feminists that sort of come to mind, right? On the academic side. I'm sure there are loads of celebrity feminists that maybe you guys can relate to more. But like academically speaking, those that have genuinely like worked for the movement and like been a part of the critique and been a part of the work and research and some of the more complex issues that have risen over time. So the first is Catherine McKinnon, right? This one maybe some of us know. Now, her whole thing is more towards like ideological purity, right? So this sort of like group of feminists will focus more on the idea that feminism is all about power structures. These are quite complex. There's really no way that you can have a feminist movement without dismantling these power structures, which basically means changing all of society as you know it. This is often a more radical and more drastic stance that you end up taking on feminism. And I mean, for those of us that are maybe perhaps on the left, this makes a lot of sense. That is to say, you sort of have to envision a new society. It is not small changes that you can make in society. This sense of like ideological purity, I think, is essential to the movement. Now, when I say it is essential, I mean it needs to exist. I don't mean it needs to be the face of the movement. And this is very important to understand. In the absence of those that bring you towards ideological purity, you have very limited ideals to look up to, right? So, in order to not dilute the message of your movement, it doesn't mean that everyone in the movement advocates for ideological purity. It means some people in the movement advocate for ideological purity. They sort of keep you like, accountable and they sort of keep you striving towards the higher ideals, like what we want the world to look like, not what the world can realistically look like in our own lifetimes. The second sort of like feminism that you kind of get, second like sort of group of feminists that you get is more so like, I guess the Susan Okin kind, which are like trying to talk about a more democratic sort of framework. In this, you understand that change comes through democratic procedures. Democratic procedures means that you need like mass buy-in, right? How do you actually implement changes in law if you don't have enough support in parliament, if you don't have like the right kind of politicians that are voted in? And it often seems like there's this sense of like trade-off that exists in terms of do we want more people in the movement, which can dilute the message, or do we want like the sense of like passion and like ideological purity? That's just like explaining the issue so far. I think somewhere where like personally I rest and where I would want to encourage everyone to do some more research is sort of where Fraser comes in. Now, her focus is on kind of revealing that this is potentially a false dichotomy. This is a false dichotomy because what we consider, let's say, the more popular version or the more acceptable version or the more palatable version has a lot to do with the existing power structures that are there, right? So what is perceived as getting more buy-in is also there because certain structures are already present that favor certain institutions. And obviously, this is a complex critique that we can't break down now. But I think the key takeaway is that if we stop imagining these as like two extremes, rather we think of the idea of like our ideological purity ideals and mass buy-in working together, it allows you to figure out which issues you want to prioritize. So, and I'm not saying that you sort of like compromise and find like a midway or something. I'm saying the conversation that this allows is what allows you to sort of strategize as a movement and push for certain kinds of change. That is not to say that we don't care about the other issues. That is to say that movements at a certain point in time have to be selective about what the ideal issues are. And like, what are the ideal issues to push for? Not like what the ideal issues are, but what are the issues that need to be prioritized, where some change is actually possible, or what does the trajectory of the movement look like? I think that trajectory naturally is driven by this conversation. So there is no like one answer to this, but it is like finding how these two like sort of converse with each other and why it is that like certain things like what we call like representation politics, right? Often in the West, there's been a lot of advocacy in the 20th century for we need more women CEOs. We need to see more women in parliament. This is what is known as like visibility politics. Now, it's interesting that this seems like this is quite difficult to do, but it naturally has more buy-in. The reason it has more buy-in is it doesn't actually sort of like question existing structures. So existing structures remain the same, and women are being told to come inside these structures and operate within these structures, as opposed to like perhaps dismantling them, which opens the other range of issues, which is more like your redistribution politics. How is wealth distributed? How are expectations distributed? How are like gender roles and like nurturing roles redistributed, right? The problem is like both of these have to like sort of work in conversation. And what that conversation looks like is different society to society, which is why you'll never really find an answer to this, right? So you can tailor this to your specific debate in the context of like maybe where you're putting this, but it is a far more complex question. The only thing I want to highlight here is maybe everyone should read a little bit more of Fraser for why this is like a false dichotomy and how both of these can actually work together in terms of finding ideal solutions where you do bring institutional change, but you bring it in a way where there's enough buy-in to actually bring it, because that's what movements look like on ground.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Now we speak about like modern feminists, right? Do you think that modern feminists should be more focused on fighting for women in third world countries for basic rights, or should they be focusing more on achieving equality in Western societies, like i.e. closing the gap between genders?
Right. So this is tough. And like, this is trying to say that, like, who is the center of the movement or who owns the movement and who doesn't, right? I think the first thing that you kind of have to recognize that all of us as either as feminists or allies or whatever it is that we want to call ourselves as, the movement is always bigger than you. So if your reason to be in the movement is just that like you have issues that are represented, you're not only in it for yourself, right? You are in it for everyone else's issues, everyone that has similar issues. So the way that you personally approach this should be that this movement is far bigger than I am. And while I would like to see my issues represented, I cannot say that my issues have to take priority in any way. Uh, and once we start with that mindset, the conversation sort of becomes easier, right? And this is on both sides. Now, Western feminism versus feminism in the East, or let's just say a developed nation versus a developing nation, it is fair to say they can never really have the same issues. But it is also fair to say Western feminists cannot represent the issues of the developing world. So on the one hand, if we say that, look, feminism should always prioritize the issues of the developing world, this assumes that Western feminists, or those of us that live in developed countries, myself included now, right? We don't have a very sound understanding of the issues of the developing world, not enough to say what should strategy look like or how do you dismantle those structures or what is like the right approach to take. So the first thing to understand is in terms of like I think actual change, the feminist movement has to be localized when it comes to action, right? Only women living within their own context and region have a
媽媽要換號嗎？
profound have like a more
會入咗
profound
嚟。
understanding of what it is that needs to be done on ground. And this is like not only do we need to have like the humility to understand that we cannot comment on like someone else's like structure and issues, but this is also understanding something as simple as feminism or standing up for the ideals of feminism, particularly when it comes to vulnerable women, it should
Ah.
not harm the vulnerable women that we're trying to protect in the first place. If you ask too much of women in developing countries, if you ask them to sort of like try to live up to all these ideals that may sound great, but in practice will significantly make their lives worse, then what are we really asking or who are we really protecting? So that's where the understanding of feminism on ground in developing nations becomes a bit more complex because you don't want someone to ascribe to a theory that in their everyday life makes things worse. And some women have had to navigate patriarchal structures to find power within those patriarchal structures to protect themselves. But as a result, they do end up somewhat reinforcing those patriarchal structures. So the balance that you tip in the developing world is very different from the cost that you pay for feminism in the developed world, right? The best way I think to go about this is to understand that there's no such singular like depiction of feminism. This is a global movement. There are many different types and variations of feminism. It is literally feminisms, and what they should look like in one part of the world should not have to be similar to another part of the world. Western women have like this unique privilege of sort of representing the global movement, maybe a little bit more than those in developing countries. At least that's how it's been in the past. And I think I would just make the messaging audience centric, right? If your advocacy is like mostly concentrated in a developed nation, or at least the audience you're speaking to, let's say it's a forum, a seminar, is mostly like those of a developed nation, then sure, talk about the issues of the developed world, right? There's no reason that you should have to stop talking about like equal
这么
pay
講嘢，
because there are like intense issues of violence in the developed
有冇
developing
講
world.
嘢？
Both of these issues are important. It
你
is
話
when you're talking to a global audience that there should be some sense of like prioritization of
係
issues.
嘛？
Start with an awareness of like, let's
點
say,
解我
issues
呢
of
話？朱哥呀，
you know, the the developing world.
朱哥
But
啊，
when your audience changes, there's no reason that the messaging shouldn't change. So when you're representing feminism on a global scale, sure, there should be a sense of prioritization. There should be a sense of awareness of that prioritization. But having that prioritization on a global scale does not mean that you don't carry a more localized version of the same feminism within like your local context. Now, in the developed world, obviously, you're not going to advocate very in the developing world, sorry, you don't want to advocate for very radical stances that are going to be a threat to your own safety. Similarly, in the developed world, you want to talk about issues that are relevant to you. I think this like sort of trade-off only comes when there's global representation that's happening, and there's no reason that you can't have a sense of prioritization. While you have a sense of prioritization on the global scale, the laws that you advocate for in your own local context are still fairly different, right? So it may sound like there's some nuance that has you have to wrap your head around. But I mean, this is just based on like how do we talk about like global politics versus how do we actually advocate or bring change in a local context. This will always look different. And I feel like we have evolved enough as a society to understand these nuances, right?
Yeah, of course. And on the topic of like sort of Western feminism, we see that there's a rise of like misandry, for example. It's like an online term. Now, do you think it's morally justified for women to hate on men? And can men actually experience discrimination through gender?
Ooh, I feel like this might be the best question. Maybe we should have started with this question. Um, That's an interesting thought, right? And I mean, I feel like all of us, it's a repetitive thought as well, because you see all these stereotypical depiction of women that just like hate men and want to burn them down or something. Um, the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about, I do want to humanize this hate a little bit. Um, Look, I think anger is a justified emotion. I also think specifically for social justice movements, anger should not be demonized as an emotion. Anger at the end of the day is a very protective like emotion, right? Your recognition that you have been wronged sort of requires this anger to exist. And then how do we express anger? I think the sort of like primitive like initial reaction is hatred. So to say that women cannot hate men or women cannot think about it, can you not hate your oppressors? It would be like you'd be lying to yourself if like you felt that you were deeply wronged by someone and your initial reaction wasn't that, oh, this is so unfair or this person is just not that great a person. So I do think that I feel like you can't demonize this reaction. I think it is somewhat justified. I think it is to some degree, this hatred is sort of like okay to exist. But I think, again, this is a very initial reaction. This is not maybe my evolved self, like as a human being, right? To a degree, I think movements should sustain a healthy degree of anger because it also motivates change. It mobilizes change. It sort of like drives you and motivates you. And insofar as that is true, it is good. And again, what are you hating really? If you're hating this abstract concept of like men without like putting a face to this person, if you're not harming anyone, if it is the injustice that you hate, well, of course you should hate it, right? I think the the idea that women hate men, it depends on like what shape or form this is visible in, right? And what sort of men do you hate? If this is the idea that you're going to hate each and every person that you encounter, I don't even realistically know how possible this is, right? I think that this is somewhat like skewed and this is like a misrepresentation online that tends to exist to sort of like also like again the stereotypical version of the feminist is you have your cats and you must hate every man that you've ever encountered. I think realistically, most feminists, when they do encounter hate, you hate a power structure. And you hate the men that participate in the power structure. Do you hate every inch and fiber of their being? No. You hate the part of them that contributes to this injustice. And if there's something wrong with that, then how else do you find justice, right? So even by hating men to a large degree, yes, you're hating the action that they're participating in. And I do think that most people are able to rationalize and sort of connect this with intention. So if there are men that are willingly, like, happily engaging in like problematic practices and sort of like celebrating that, should you not hate them? I think you should hate them. But I think beyond that, as a human being, you understand the nuance that not everyone has contributed to this power structure. Not everybody is aware of this power structure. I think you hate people to the degree that they are actively potentially harming you. I do think you should hate people who actively harm you. How else would you like protect yourself? And hating people is not equal to going down and burning their house, right? So I feel like hate is just such a loaded word in that sense, but it is justified to the extent that, look, I do think people, to whatever capacity they can, should stand up for themselves, should raise their voice against injustice. And that comes from a recognition of injustice. Hatred is a starting point of that. But no, realistically, like, I don't think that most feminists, like, are actively in any like violent way hating on men, right? And I also think that this is a hatred of the action, this is a hatred of the practice. This is a recognition of injustice where we feel like the men that could do more are not doing enough. So in to that extent, I feel like that hatred is somewhat justified. But that hatred is really exaggerated online as to what the hatred is for.
Yeah, that's really good. This one can be a little controversial, but because of like the historical patterns of institutional power, do you think that religion is inherently oppressive towards women?
Oh, okay. So I tend to get a lot of religious questions. I will say this. So in 2023, I coached Team Pakistan, and this kid called me like an atheist. And this kid calls me an atheist because I was the only one who had to like help them sort of like unlearn some of their religious biases. Now in 2025, I'm coaching Team Canada and I'm teaching them religion instead. So I've like seen like the opposite ends of this, particularly with debate coaching. Um, and obviously I've had to do that answer a lot of religious questions and also growing up where I did, particularly questions in terms of like how religion like pertains to women. And look, I'm not like a theological sort of like expert in any way, but my version of this is not what religion does, says, or doesn't do. I think my version of this is I don't really think there is a single thing as religion, honestly speaking. And look, religion is a collection of many things. It's a collection of rituals, it's a collection of these texts that we think are divine or not divine. It's a collection of so many cultural practices. But more importantly, it is an accumulation of different interpretations. Because it's an accumulation of different interpretations, Islam itself, right? What Islam looks like in one country is very different from what Islam looks like in another country. What Islam looks like in a certain neighborhood in that country is not the same as it is in another neighborhood within the same country. So, I mean, we can argue about like the sort of like integrity or purity of religion as much as we want, but I don't think anyone agrees on what like religion is to begin with, right? And this is true of like Christianity, Islam, like most religions, right? So I don't know how much religious integrity matters given the vast number of interpretations that exist out there. I think then the more reasonable question that we ask ourselves, and we ask ourselves every time we make laws, every time we look at like state institutions as well, what does religion look like insofar as how is it practiced, right? So it doesn't really matter what this theoretical abstract concept is. How do we view religion? We view it in the way that people represent it. And how do people represent it? People often represent religion the same way they represent everything else. They tend to support things that are maintaining their power structure, and they tend to sort of like, um, sort of come down on things that oppose the loss of power. Religion is a narrative in terms of how it plays out in real life, right? And this is not me respecting or disrespecting religion. I'm just saying materially. If it is just a narrative, if it is a belief system, there's no way that one belief system is like, let's say, better than another belief system. The way we evaluate how belief systems operate in society is this harming someone? Is this not harming someone? We can't say that your moral scale of value is objectively better than my moral scale of value. We really don't know that, right? The metric by which we would compare your moral scale of value would be how it is that you would like impact another individual. Insofar, that is true. Religion is anything and everything. Religion is one of the most vague, abstract ideas in the world. Most religions are quite, like I would say, poetic and metaphorical. Again, this is not me saying that there's great pieces of literature or anything. This is me just saying this in more in terms of like linguistic composition. Because they are more abstract and metaphorical, people use religion to mean anything and everything. So whether religion inherently like is problematic towards women or not, again, it is whether people are problematic to women or not. The people who want to be problematic towards women will find numerous religious interpretations to do so. And those that, would like to support the feminist cause will find other sorts of like interpretations to find a way to kind of like justify a religious practice or not justify a religious practice. But inherently, most humans are very selective in how they use religion, right? So, does it really matter what the religion says if your own metric is so selective that you pick the things that are making sense to you anyway, or have some sort of like practical demonstration in your society? And this is why I find the whole question of like, theologically speaking, is religion oppressive or not? We don't really know, theologically speaking, as the average person at least, what religion is. So I feel like this question is just like a moot point, right? I have seen very religious people um, be like more or less like feminists in practice, even if they don't use the label. And then I've seen like like non-religious people claiming to be feminists also be like absolutely horrible towards women. So, I mean, sure, is it something that's manipulated as a narrative? Maybe. And most political narratives, most narratives are otherwise manipulated as well. So yeah, I find the question like, despite growing up in a religious society, I find it irrelevant at this point in terms of how we like pursue feminism. We would have to differentiate like our ideals and the movement from any sort of like pre-existing political or otherwise belief system or narrative, regardless. So yeah, that's just my take on religion.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like you just speak so deeply to everyone. Um, Before we wrap up, does anyone have any questions? We'll just give them like a minute to think before, I guess, they have to still debate round three and round four.
I
Yeah.
will say this. I do feel like maybe I conclusively don't answer any of these four questions. And I don't think these four questions are meant to really be answered if you think about it. And that's the beauty of debate, right? So it's really good that, this is a student-led competition again, because I think more people are likely to like participate that way. There's like less barrier to entry. The whole beauty of debate is understanding that in different contexts, like all of these narratives like have some value and then they can make some sense. And that there's so much nuance in terms of like what the human experience is. So we always look for like a sense of context, and we always look for like how do we tailor our existing belief systems and sort of like continuously like reshape them in that context. So I think one of the beautiful things about debate is that we don't need to get like fixated or like marry ourselves to like any opinion. And that's kind of what keeps you like growing as well in terms of how you encounter whatever belief system you're going to be a part of. You have to constantly like be questioning it and like reapplying it in terms of like new details that are coming forward, new people that are coming forward, new challenges that are coming forward, right? Like I don't know how religion applies to artificial intelligence, right? So we don't know any of these things, and that's sort of like the beauty of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and talking with us. If anyone doesn't have any questions, then we'll wrap it up now. I think, yeah, draw will be coming out soon anyways. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you all. Okay, bye.
Best of luck, everyone. Thank you.